We're now going to have a final panel discussion, and the way this discussion will work is that I've got questions for probably about the first half an hour or so, and then I'll open it up to you guys in the audience. So please be thinking about any questions that you have, any issues that you'd like to raise, because we've got an excellent panel. I'll just quickly go through on our panel. We've got John Cannings, the National Health Market Leader and a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Sally Crossing, the Chair of Cancer Voices New South Wales. Dr Masum Hossain, the Regional President of Asia Pacific Pfizer Oncology. Dr Graham Mann, the Chair of Sydney University Cancer Research Network. David Thomas, Professor David Thomas, the Cancer Division of the Kinghorn Cancer Centre. Christian Sellers, who is the Director of Market Access, Public Affairs and Customer Centricity at MSD. And Richard Vines, who I'm sure you all know, the co-founder of Rare Cancers Australia, and we're also delighted to be joined by Professor Ian Fraser, who spoke to us earlier today, and we're absolutely delighted that he's been able to stay for this part of the event. So a round of applause for all our panellists, and welcome everybody. So I thought we'd just start the discussion, given we haven't had a patient group up on the stage before, just to talk from the patient point of view, and I thought I'd just start with Sally and John. How much more difficult is it to get good treatments if you're diagnosed with a rare cancer? And please, if anyone else has any points to add, please feel free to jump in. But Sally, might start with Sally and John. From your experiences and other patients that you've come into contact with, what do they tell you about how difficult it is to get a good treatment if it's a rare cancer?
Well, as we've been hearing all morning, all today, it is more difficult because it's more difficult to diagnose to start off with. And there aren't, as you're a smaller population, there aren't as many experts who can help you. But I'm not an expert in rare cancers.
John, is that your experience? Would you like to just share a little bit of your experience for those people who don't know you?
I think it depends on where you live. May also depend on your socio-economic position in life. So I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, which is inoperable, and at the moment there is no cure. I actually consider myself to be very fortunate in that I have a rare cancer, less than, the figures vary, 4% of all lung cancers, but it's an ALK, it's anaplastic lymphomes kinase, and there was a targeted treatment for that. When I was diagnosed, however, that treatment was not reimbursed on the PBS, and therefore it was a private script. Now, I was very fortunate because I could afford to purchase that drug, and I went straight onto that drug. There were a large number of people who had exactly the same cancer that I had, different stages, etc., who would not have been able to access that drug because at that stage the access scheme, the compassionate access scheme, had already closed. Now, if I'd grown up and lived in New Zealand, I'd still not be able to access this drug other than buying it privately, and it's very expensive. So I think the luck of which side of the ditch you may have been born on and your position in life to be able to afford this drug ought not be the basis upon which you should be entitled to access that treatment. I think it's inequitable and I think it's unfair. And in fact, I think Richard has in one of his testimonials from a chap in South Australia where he said Australians should not die because they can't afford to live.
Richard, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I think that's a very succinct way of putting it, and we deal a lot with, for those of you who don't know, Sick or Treat on a broader basis is, part of Sick or Treat is a crowdfunding service that we provide for cancer patients who can't, whose medication is not listed on the PBS, and so we see a lot of this, and there are a number of implications, I think, that I'd be interested in the panel's view too as we move forward. But if a drug is not listed on the PBS, then it is often not prescribed at at an appropriate time in the treatment. It tends to be used as a last resort. So whereas crizotinib is perhaps best thought of as a first-line treatment for this, we had one patient in South Australia who we finally got involved with when he was in intensive care and probably days away, and he is now, swimming at 1.5 kilometres every 2 days. He's a 36-year-old father of 2, so he had a lot to give. So I think that it's not just about the delays in listing are not just a process of, gee, we haven't got enough evidence yet, and maybe there's compassionate access, maybe there's not. It actually prevents people from getting access regardless of how they can either afford it or fund it, because the system asks people to stay within the PBAC, and I'd be interested in other people's comments. There's a lot to do.
And maybe I might ask David, but with your patients that you see, is that an experience that you have with your patients as well, that some fall into this category that Richard's just referred to?
Yeah, there aren't many trials for sarcomas because they're 1% of all cancers, and there's 80 different subtypes. So every single variety is rare. Some of them are quite molecularly distinct, which makes them a very attractive sort of target, but the trials just don't exist and they don't come south. And then the evidence base is small. So I have patients who have taken advantage of what Richard and Kate have set up to raise funds to get access for a 36-year-old with metastatic osteosarcoma who had been through 7 lines of chemotherapy in 12 months and had a lot to live for. And another sort of, it's a recurrent theme, she was in ICU the week before we started that treatment, and it brought about 3 or 4 months of benefit, and it's pretty significant, I think. It's not a solution, and it's too ad hoc. I just hate the idea of this being ad hoc and not generating some, being able to know whether this is something we should be pushing for more broadly or not. It runs against the grain. So I think it's certainly something that people face every day.
And just staying with the patient perspective for a minute, are there any other, we talked about access to drugs and the ad hoc nature of it, are there any other particular challenges that patients with rare cancers face that you think needs to be addressed in this forum?
Yeah, I think...
Graham?
I mean, many people will be able to speak to this, but I think for many of them, they lack a community of people with a similar experience. And I think we can do a lot, I think to emphasise the commonalities across cancer types, and to look at the way we support and resource patient groups and consumer groups, so that people do not have that terrible sense of isolation that they're the only one having their experiences. For the most part, they almost certainly aren't, even if they never saw another person with their cancer. There are a lot of people out there who'd be able to help them to feel as though their experience is at least a common one that people are really trying to help them with. So I think that aspect of community and isolation is an extremely serious problem.
And
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, sure, John.
There's a number of cancer patients in the room, and they, I think, have probably experienced something similar. You lose choice. You lose control over your life, whether that's for an extended period of time or a short period of time. There's a near irreparable change that you go through. The things that are really important to patients and their carers are around communication, really solid, evidence-based information, not everything you get off the internet, but being part of the decision-making process is very important, and having a coordinated care around you. There is a lot of studies, there's a lot of evidence now coming out about the benefits and value of integrated care from an efficiency and a cost perspective, but for patients it's about actually regaining some of that control. I did the survey around the choices last night, and yes, some of those questions are quite challenging about what you would give up, and I have had the experience of many of the adverse side effects to be an informed decision maker, but there is a disconnect. There is an absolute disconnect between what patients and carers want and what the healthcare system provides. one of my partners has had cancer and he was given not much choice. And the specialist said, you know, you've got X percentage chance of surviving. And he said, well, you know, if that's the value base that you're making it, that's a terrible proposition. I don't want to survive, I want to thrive, I want to live a normal life. I actually want to get on and have a quality of life for whatever period of time I have. Not, you know, it's all about survival, because many cancer patients don't survive. And I love that comment that Fred Hollows made when a journalist in the field said, I can't believe you're still working so hard when you're so sick. And Fred Hollows looked absent in his eyes and he said, my death is no more certain than yours.
Yeah. Good point. Sally, did you have a point before we move on?
Yes. As someone with metastatic breast cancer, I'm not rare, of course, but having been at it for 20 years, I think that's fairly rare. So I sympathise with quite a few of these things. But I wanted to say that Cancer Voices facilitates a 30-strong group called the Australian Cancer Consumer Network. All the groups are either straight consumer groups involved in advocacy, or they also may provide information, support and so on. But we've recently, for this, just picking up on John's comment, surveyed them all to ask them exactly what do people with cancer want, and what do they think is important, what do they think we should advocate for, what really needs to change. It's fine that there are studies are done, academic studies, but I think the value of what people affected by cancer actually informed, thoughtful ones particularly, although, you know, very often you get the sort of the straight from the heart thing too. And we're collecting all that and we'll be reporting on it, so we'll be able to share it with decision makers and maybe move a few mountains.
Look forward to hearing that. Now, we might just talk a little bit about research into rare cancers, and there's obviously a lot less research into rare cancers than there are into the more common cancers. So I might just ask Ian and a few of the other scientists here, what impact does that have, the fact that there is a lot less research done into a rare cancer?
Well, I guess the challenge that we face is that if the research isn't done, we can't answer the questions that patients want answers to. We can't tell them whether their cancer will respond to a particular drug with any certainty, because we just don't have the evidence. And we can't tell them what's likely to happen with choices of treatment, because we don't have the evidence on that either. What we're going to have to do to answer these questions is to work on a global basis. You know, a cancer which is rare, relatively speaking, in Australia, where we're smaller in population than California, can be answered on a global basis if we can get the networks working. And across the planet, a rare cancer actually becomes relatively common, but it's quite difficult to get the networks working like that for a whole range of reasons, both governmental and organisational. So that's one of the challenges we face. The other one, of course, is that if you're wanting to study the basis of a cancer and understand how it works or why it comes about, if there are very few patients with that cancer around, it's going to be quite difficult to get the answers. Genomics has helped a great deal with that, I have to say, because you can ship samples of cancer from one end of the planet to the other if you need to, and get answers that way. But it still makes us less able to predict what's going to happen, how it's happened, how we should be doing something about it. Research does solve these problems, but we're going to have to think a different way of doing research in the future to make sure we get the answers for the rare cancers.
I think that's been one of the good things out of today, is that there have been ideas that are out of the box and different ways of thinking about things. And I might just pick up on something that I read that David said, that you've said when it comes to rare cancers, there's systematic neglect of rare cancer across the system. What did you mean by that?
I mean that the way that we've thought about medicine is inherently conservative. You know, to the extent that you're creative in medicine, you could wind up in a law court. You're not supposed to improvise. You're supposed to follow. But unfortunately, knowledge goes so far, right? And the patients are, for rare cancers, they're often beyond the bounds where the light shines, and you have to go into uncertain areas. And I think I'm not advocating that one should do research or trials just for its own sake, but it just happens that we're now in an era where we can get deeper and deeper knowledge about each individual's cancer than we've ever had before. And in parallel with that, we've got these drugs that are coming along in increasing numbers, which are being applied using a paradigm that's 150 years old. And I think in some ways it's a little frustrating to be finding that the problem is not, you know, the ineluctable problem of the complex cancer genome, which is the issue, but actually how you get from where you know it actually works just across the table to the patient opposite you without winding up, you know, in breach of bureaucratic, regulatory and other barriers. And even if you do that, I think there's an irony that's emerging where a researcher can be driven towards finding a cure for a cancer, and actually if he thinks about it hard enough or she thinks about it hard enough, that we can't afford to do it. And all of that is a function of the process that we as a society decide to impose upon research for people who don't have the time to spare. And I think in some ways this goes beyond our areas of expertise. It goes beyond the patient-doctor relationship in the laboratory, and it goes to, we need to influence, we need the voices of the community to bear on the problem.
Graham, did you have a comment?
Yes, look, this is going to sound incredibly mundane, but one of the major drivers of the progress in cancer has really come from simple things like managing to actually bank frozen tissue from enough cases of cancer internationally to get meaningful numbers. And I think the way in which, if we look at how those banks of tissues arose, they typically have arisen out of the major common cancers because there's a community of researchers or clinicians who are involved in that particular cancer and consumers who are involved in it. So what goes missing with the rare cancers, of course, is that while there may well be interested researchers, there may be interested clinicians, they're fragmented, and we don't have basal, readily accessible banking of frozen cancer tissue in our major medical centres. If that were happening, if that had been happening as a kind of a basic deliverable of our healthcare system across this country, every rare cancer in Australia would already have about 100 or 200 cancers in the bank, and we would already have done their genomes. You know, so that fundamental question of integrating tissue collection within our healthcare system would go a huge way to improving the outlook for rare cancers.
Christian, did you have a comment you want to make?
I wanted to pick up on a point that David raised earlier about the distance of getting the drug from one end of the table to the other end of the table and getting it to the patient, and also your comment about the 100-year-old paradigm that we're operating in scientifically. I think to some extent what we're experiencing at a political and regulatory level is very, very similar to that. And I think doing the science, generating the evidence for rare cancers is extraordinarily difficult for some of the newer therapies that have broader applicability, and it will take many years. And in many ways, the phase 2, phase 3 trials, if we ever get them completed, probably won't say a great deal more than what we have already in phase 1. The challenge, though, is that the level of effort required to get things through the TGA, PBAC process is so unbelievably huge. Our own organisation has just done it for one of the immunotherapies for melanoma. We managed to get through the TGA in 8 months. We managed to get through the PBAC on the first attempt. And it took an inordinate effort from a team of around 30 people locally. The global organisation are very happy for us to have done it, but frankly, there are a whole lot of people who aren't going to talk to us again as a consequence. Now, we are examining that particular therapy in 30 different tumour types, plus 150 trials and indications. There's no way we can do that 150 times. We have to find a more efficient way of getting this across. And I think part of it also has to do with the prospective nature that we expect for informing decision-making. And you kind of almost want to say, well, if you've got a therapy and you think the therapy is going to work, you use it. And if the outcome is forthcoming, then payment follows. Yeah. And in many areas, that can be done, particularly for rarer cancers, for the sarcomas you were mentioning and so forth. We have to try and flip to a different model, particularly when the TGA has said these products in general, we know what the safety profile is, we know how to manage the risks. Every hospital and treating centre will have some understanding in the relevant departments on how to manage use. So it's there. But there's this process which is entirely unfit for purpose for those smaller populations in place. And certainly, if I look at what the Department has done, Department of Health has done in the last few years, I mean, crizotinib is one example, I think immunotherapy is another. They have been very flexible in some of this, what they're calling managed access schemes, to manage financial risk. But I wonder with rare cancers whether we actually need to go a hell of a lot further. And we have to start having, I mean, patients, we've spoken a lot about patient-centered treatment, but I wonder whether patient-centric payment is something we really should be looking at, sort of some form of capitated, you know, if a life year, PBAC is saying a life year for cancer is, I don't know, $50,000 per life year, then find some means of saying, well, the thing that made a difference for this patient was this treatment, and therefore there's a means of risk sharing that payment out. And if patients don't respond, fair enough. Then those patients, you know, there's just a service fee or whatever. But we have to flip that because there's absolutely no way organizations like mine, the PBAC or the TGA, can do what we did for melanoma 150 times.
Can I just add to
Masum, did you
that?
have a comment?
I think everything you've said, Christian, is spot on.
I'm just
What
gonna
worries
move
me...
the microphones. Could everyone move the microphones a little bit closer? Are you hearing okay, everybody?
What worries me is that medical practice and science is evolving in one direction, and unfortunately what I see the systems, both the regulatory and the reimbursement systems, evolving in a slightly different direction. And that's causing quite a problem. To illustrate that, personalised medicine is obviously taking us in the right direction in terms of where we want to be in the future in terms of individualising treatment. And that's great. We're diagnosing patients at a molecular level. What that's done in a regulatory environment is it's required us to now have a codependent technology pathway, which is incredibly complex. It's evolving in real time. It's adding additional layers of complexity and work, and I think, Christian, you're referring to that. That is not the solution we need. We need things to get simpler, not more complicated and more resource intensive as we evolve in the right direction for medical practice.
Now, I might just stick with you guys just while we're talking about this with the pharmaceutical companies we've got here. And the question I wanted to ask, how do you reconcile the conflict that pharma companies have being a commercial entity on one hand, yet dealing in life-saving drugs? I'm sure it's a question you do get asked. So would you mind addressing that?
I can have a stab.
It's a tricky question, but it's an important one.
It's funny because I reread the Senate inquiry report last night, and there are a whole lot of sections. Whenever there's discussion about commercial, you can almost hear the eerie music in the background, and the tone. It takes a very particular tone. I mean, the fact of the matter is we are commercial entities, and we do the one thing that we do extraordinarily well is shift enormous blocks of capital into places where we think there's a return. And I'm sure there are lots of discussions we can have here and debates we can have here about pricing, and I'm sure that we will. I guess in some ways you could argue that it's a sort of good problem to have because we have the therapies that actually work. And the reason we have the therapies that work is because the science was there, I think the structures, the institutions were there, and in many instances the volume of investment required from our investors, our shareholders, was available to move things along. So I think, granted, there are challenges. We have seen some examples, some were referred to earlier today, of pricing practices in the US and other, which are beyond the pale and are inexcusable. So there are many instances where corporate entities will behave in a very problematic way. And the community has a response to that, shareholders have a response to that, that's completely fine. What works commercially, though, and the reason why we have to keep talking to each other, not demonize different parts of the environment, is because the one thing the industry does extraordinarily well is its ability to move capital. My organization, once immunotherapy, it was clear that this was going to be a very important thing for our organization. We basically bet the company on one molecule. We spend about $7 billion a year on research. We're spending probably about half of that now on one molecule. 150 trials, 30 cancer types. No government could have done that. Yeah. And we're not the only organization doing it. At least 3 others are doing the same. And the volume of trials being done in this space in Australia are largely being bankrolled by that. So that's, there are a whole lot of access issues as well, and those we have to deal with. But to the same extent, there's a lot of supply side benefit that comes from investors seeing this promise and putting the capital where they see the promise to be.
Masum, did you have some thoughts?
I'll just very quickly add to that. I actually don't see this as a conflict at all. And I think it's wrong for us to forcibly see this as a conflict because it raises interesting discussions. I think within the commercial environment, there are the right conditions to encourage innovation. We've seen that happen, and it happens day to day. You have the right incentives, you have the right IP protection, you have the resources. That is definitely not in any way to discount the huge benefits that comes from academic research, which one can argue happens in a commercial environment as well, because there's exchange of money and so on and so forth. But I think in the commercial environment, you have absolutely the right conditions to encourage innovation and progress of medical science. So I absolutely don't see it as a conflict.
So John and Ian, did you have a comment?
Just, if I could just jump in. Put your hand up if you've got superannuation.
Superannuation.
You've what?
You've got superannuation.
Put your hand up if you have superannuation.
Got superannuation? Well, superannuation funds, big pension funds, are the biggest shareholders of pharmaceutical companies in the world. And it's your superannuation funds and your fund managers that are demanding return on investment. If you want to get to the nut of economics, you want a return on your funds employed to provide for you in your retirement and old age. Or let's hope you don't get sick, because you'll get your superannuation fund earlier. And they're driving the analysts who make decisions around where they're going to invest that capital. And it's how these companies invest that capital in health that drives the investment back. So you can't divorce these things from the other.
Ian, did you have a comment on the previous remarks?
I think that we have to remember that there is a third player in this game, and that's the ultimate payer for the drugs once we've got them, and that's federal government, who spend 10% of our GDP on healthcare, as do most countries in the world. And it's increasing, as it is in most countries in the world, to be more and more of the amount of money that we actually earn, the money that the government has at its disposal. So we are obviously delighted that we're getting the benefits of these new treatments, and what we're buying is longer, healthier lives, but it comes at a cost. And governments are, well, they live in as I've said already this morning, they live in an economy rather than in a society, and they have to balance the books. So it's not a zero-sum game. If we spend more on health, less of what government has at its disposal will be spent elsewhere, or we have to make corresponding savings within health. And we can't escape from that part of the agenda. We want these new treatments, we want the benefits from them, we are going to have to save elsewhere. And it does put the responsibility back on the community. We know that 30% of all the expenditure in health in this country is avoidable just by us doing better for ourselves. And we can't turn around to government and say we want you to spend more on health if we don't at the same time educate our kids that they've got to look after themselves. So the cost of health care that we can control, the bit that we have control over, falls to cover the cost of the new stuff that's coming along that will give us the benefit. It's all part of the same equation, and we can't ignore that bit.
Good point. David, did you have a thought there?
I just
comments?
think, in some ways, this sort of, it's like a network that's required, and we've grown in organic cottage industries, not to put it that way, but within research, for example, the research is focused on the molecule, the clinician is focused on the patient, the trials are focused upon the progression-free endpoints in a phase 2. But in a way, I think it's a challenge to imagination, and I can imagine considering the social benefit to prioritize where we invest to maximize the return on the social investment. And I think that could be done in a partnership model, taking the analogy even further. The network needs to involve the essential partners who provide the drugs, but also prevention and early detection. I mean, Ian's own work in HPV categorically changes options for, within this country, for one reason, but if you go to Papua New Guinea, the leading cause of death in girls between 20 and 40 is not breast cancer, it's cervical cancer, a completely preventable disease. It doesn't have the infrastructure to deliver, pap smears and cone biopsies and all that. It doesn't have the capacity, but it is possible to vaccinate and leave a legacy for that individual that will protect them through their lifespan. And that's thinking about where the interventions will have the longest term. Currently we're thinking in microcosms without considering the consequences beyond that. And I think we're getting to a crunch point where the advances in science, a bit like atomic development, you know, there comes a point where you have to bring all the elements together to decide what is wise. And I don't think that's impossible, but I think it needs to be recognised, and there's a few different players who aren't used to thinking in that way need to be brought together.
Sally, did you have a comment?
Well, I just want to comment from the point of view of running a cancer consumer advocacy organisation with my team. You know, for all these years, we've all been saying there's something wrong with the processes in the system, they need to be fixed. And we all recognise what the problems are. From our point of view, we contribute, we get involved with the Cancer Drugs Alliance, we take part in the Senate inquiries and so on, and try to put the consumer view, and also realise that we're taxpayers as well. What we really want is someone to sort it out, all sit down together. Now, how this is going to happen, it's got to be politically driven, I suppose. We've got to find some champions who will say, look, it can't be too hard to make the process simpler for you guys, to make clinical trials less expensive and onerous, more suited to the situations we're now in, where there are going to be smaller populations with particular molecular profiles and so on. How do we make sure we get the biggest bang for the buck, which is important, the economy and so on.
We need a different approach.
We need a circuit breaker of some sort which will take us to the next level, so we can actually all hop in there and
Graham?
fix it.
Just a comment about the way the ecosystem works here, and this is just to support all the comments that have been made. Some of the most important knowledge generation happens after drugs go to market, and that there are enormous efficiencies that can be gained through what's called investigator-initiated research, where the drug company may provide the drug to the study, but it's not their study anymore. It's actually being run by your local neighbourhood academic researchers. And this is not I'm not crying poor on my own behalf. My own group has been very fortunate. But you must understand that the academic research system in this country is in a state of crisis at the moment, and the capacity for researchers in all disciplines, not just STEM, to do the things that the country needs evidence about is currently rather badly compromised. And so, something that Rare Cancers can do for the country is to try and reverse that for the benefit of everybody.
Excellent. Now, look, we might move to the audience questions. I've monopolised the panel for the first half an hour. So just pop up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yep, John Stubbs.
Hi. Is that on?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, John Stubbs is my name. I'm here as an ex-cancer patient, I think, although I wear many other hats. I've just been at the NHMRC conference in town, and it's about policymakers, health policymakers talking to researchers, and the health policymakers are on that side of the wall, and the researchers are on this side of the wall. So it's another silo that's being created. So there are words that have come up here, and one word I'd like to raise is the risk. Cancer patients are prepared to take risks. We go into clinical trials. We don't want to be guinea pigs, but we are prepared to take risks. So I think rare cancer patients, when there's nothing else, we are prepared to take. I had CML, which I suppose is classified as a rare cancer. So how can that be fitted into the equation around treatment, access to drugs and things like that, on the understanding that we, along with our families and that, are prepared to take that extra step?
Who would like to deal with the issue of risk? Richard?
I can't answer it in detail, but I am aware. I sent a paper the other day that there's a movement in the US which calls itself the right to try, and basically it's a movement to have laws changed and freed up so that if you are terminal, then none of the rules apply, and if you decide you want to go and try taking Coca-Cola and Aspro or whatever, then it's your right. And I think that sometimes it is a little frustrating when you have regulatory bodies worried about the side effects of a drug when the side effects of no drug is end of life. Then and I'm
Can I just ask that, Christian, and whether what would pharmaceutical companies think of that kind of idea, that there is an inherent right that patients may have to be able to try something irrespective of the risks and the side effects? How do you think if that was introduced in Australia that you guys would feel about that? So it brings us back to those ethical issues we were discussing.
I think if we had the right regulatory and reimbursement environment, we could absolutely make that happen. One of the issues that we may need to overcome, and maybe this is again a regulatory issue, is a drug that is very early on in its development will not have a well-developed risk profile, a safety profile. And for a company to hand that over to the clinical setting has certain implications for the company. It's a legal environment, the regulatory environment, if we can cope within that, and the clinician is adequately satisfied that the risk-benefit based on what we know at that time is worthwhile, and the patient, as Richard says, patients may have a higher risk appetite. And if that's okay, I don't see why we can't do that.
Interesting. Christian, how do you feel your company would
I think my
react?
view is pretty much the same. The challenge with those sorts of things, though, is, I mean, as you were saying earlier about networks and coordination, it's something that would require a lot of cooperation. I think to require that of any one part of the regulator, of the pharma company, of the clinician in isolation would be extremely hard. But if it's something that you could have a dialogue and standards around, I think it's something that could be done.
Just from a
John?
patient perspective, I agree that our risk appetite is probably much higher. Obviously, that's an individual perspective, but it gets complicated when you can see that there is access arrangements and there are trials in other countries where you can get access to a new or an existing drug for a different indication, and you can't do that here. And the choice is therefore you have to leave your own country to go and try and access that treatment. That seems to me to be a bizarre result.
Must be extremely frustrating for patients to see that if they were only living in the US or the UK, that they would have access.
I think one of the other implications
Richard?
of that, I think it is important, is that, and I'm interested in there are people, everybody on this panel knows more about this than I do, but as I understand it, it is possible to have a situation where it is almost mandatory for a company to stop compassionate access once they hit a certain level of evidence if they're applying for, say, FDA approval, because you've sort of got your body of evidence and you can't afford to have the drug still out in the public, because then you've got to keep recording adverse events. So it's almost like the system works to take access away, and that seems to me to be really insane. And there should be some way of drawing a line without disadvantaging the company, but also not disadvantaging patients to have some access.
Did Masum or Christian, did you have a comment about the fact that that's the system as it stands?
I'm not entirely sure on the system. I mean, within the Australian context,
more
but in
globally.
In the global,
if you've got a circumstance where you're going for regulatory approval and you've got the evidence, you've got the body of evidence that you need to apply, then there is a disincentive to leave the compassionate access program in place, because it creates the potential for adverse events, and therefore it's a bit complicated. But
well, Richard, maybe you could talk briefly about the meeting you've just returned from, the patient advocacy meeting in New York, and in particular you were talking to me earlier about the French scheme and how that works in terms of benefiting patients getting earlier access to medications.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I attended a conference last week for patient advocates that was sponsored by Pfizer, so thank you, Masum. And there were 22 patient groups there, and at various times about 10 pharmaceutical companies. And a couple of things to report. One is that our RCA's peers in the patient advocacy group in Australia can hold their head high. We were certainly an observation of other organisations around the world did not leave us wanting. And I think that there were a number of really interesting points that came out. The one that really shocked me was that there was almost a unanimous, I don't quite want to use the word derision, but scepticism about the value of the outcomes of clinical trials, and the reality being that we now have a system where, and I think I found that Graham's presentation this morning, when there's hundreds of different types of melanoma, but we put them all in the one thing and then try to work out whether the drug works, but it's really only going to work for 30%. And and there was just uniform scepticism about their value, and there was an organisation there called LifeRaft that has built its own cancer registry for GIST, gastrointestinal stromal tumours, and they have run this. They have 2,200 patients on it. It's very rare, but they've been doing it for a while, and their results from a particular drug treatment is so radically different to the clinical trial results that it's better, I have to say, which is the last thing you'd probably expect. But it really made me think, well, have we got a system in place? And this morning's presentations really reinforced that. Have we now got a system in place around clinical trials that have been outstripped by the technology and the scientific developments? And if we do have that, then that would strike me as a matter of some urgency that it be addressed.
Did we have any questions from the audience at the moment? Yes? We've got about 15 minutes left, so...
I'll keep it quick then. So Mark Carley from the genomics group at Garvan. I wanted to ask this extremely good panel on their thoughts on basket trials. So it strikes me that if we can use genomics to identify a marker that's got a good drug, that's got to be a great thing for rare cancers, because you might be inclined to try that.
So who would like to just give a lay explanation of a basket trial? Who would like to jump in? David?
So in a basket trial, it depends. There's two different types. There's umbrella trials and basket trials. But the general concept is somebody comes in with a tumour, and you test the tumour, and depending upon what you find in the typically genomic test, then you match that to a particular therapy. It's a way of structured it's like a structured personalised medicine program evaluating outcome.
Irrespective of where the cancer came from.
Yes, in many cases.
So you give an example. Can you give an example? Like someone might come in with, a particular cancer, but then they find out that a drug to treat another cancer will actually work better on that tumour, despite the fact they don't have that particular cancer.
Yeah. So I mean, a good example would be a gene called HER2, which is famously the target of Herceptin, the drug that works in breast cancer. And it's found amplified in a subset of other cancer types, gastric cancer, which is a particularly nasty disease, and pancreatic cancer, which is even worse. And there is some reasonable evidence to suggest that if you target Herceptin against HER2 amplified gastric cancer, you get just as good a response. And there are some other examples of that kind. So a basket trial might be to say, let's take everybody who doesn't have breast cancer who's got HER2 amplification and test them. And if they've got an amplified HER2, we would treat them with Herceptin and generate an evidence base that it might work in other disease entities, and thereby modify the way in which it gets approved. That's the general concept.
So the particular question was, how do you think a basket trial might help in patients with a rare cancer?
Well, because it becomes agnostic to the cancer type. Many trials are, for example, the use of a drug in breast cancer, or it might be in bowel cancer or in pancreatic cancer, which naturally excludes anybody who doesn't happen to have that cancer type. And the reality is, once a cancer's spread, the notion of anatomy is somewhat irrelevant to the patient, right? It doesn't matter where it is. In fact, the best example of this is something called carcinoma of unknown primary, which is when an unfortunate person comes forward, has a Mets in lots of sites, and you take a biopsy, you don't know where the original tumour is, and so your treatment is entirely guesswork. And under that circumstance, it doesn't really matter, because the only thing that you use the histotype of origin for is to guide you as to the best choice of treatment. Now we can do the test on the tumour and say, this is that the tumour's telling us is important, and it might even tell you about where it came from in the first place, incidentally. So basket trials could be really powerful, because you could open up something that is not 20 trials, which would be an insurmountable. It's about $10 million to run a phase 2 study. And it takes about 2 to 5 years for each phase 2. So if we take sarcomas, 80 different tumours, and I needed to open up 80 different trials, each which would enroll 3 to 5 patients for example, it would just become a complete nightmare. But if I can open one trial for which any of those patients could be enrolled and test them and match them against therapies. But the thing is, you need partnerships to make all of that work. And there was a point I wanted to make that came out, was latent in the discussion. The one party that is not at this table and party to this discussion are representatives of the government, which serves the people in this room and who interact with pharma. And it's clear that there's a role for government in this whole process, I think. We're talking to a person who is not here, in effect. And I just wonder, how one could go about making, through the NHMRC, the government will fund research that enables these trials to occur, but we don't mandate that there's a kind of interaction with pharma. That's an obvious thing where we could use our existing investments to try and just logically connect the drug with the investment in genomics, for example.
Graham, would you have a quick comment?
I guess this is going to sound like highlighting something that's absurd, really, but you could ask the question, why are there 150 trials going on this immune checkpoint inhibitor when there's nothing about that immune function, that shielding of tumours from the immune system that seems to be specific to cancer A, B, C, D, E. It would have been like breaking up the hypertension trials of hypertension drugs by some artificial thing of whether we measured it in the left arm or the right arm or the leg. It's basically refusing to see the underlying unity of cancer.
That's a great analogy. When you put it like that, it just makes no sense at all. One thing that we have talked about, Richard and I were talking about, that given government isn't here in this meeting at the moment, that the learnings from today will be put together hopefully and put forward to the right people so that they can hear some of the really innovative and interesting stuff that we've heard today. So any further questions? Yes?
Just linked to that, I wanted to make a comment about the recent Senate inquiry report and where the bipartisan recommendations made in that report are a really good opportunity for all stakeholders now to provide feedback back to the government, the Minister of Health, and encourage her to respond to some of the recommendations in that inquiry, or in the report, one of which is a fit-for-purpose approach to assessment and reimbursement of medicines like medicines for rare cancers, and also reviewing the need for a national cancer registry. And Professor Fraser, you mentioned this morning about, we've been trying to do this and link data and develop registries at a national level for 30 years. Is this not our opportunity now to have further discussions with the Minister? The Senate reports put it on the table. They're recommending it. There's an opportunity for all of us to really emphasise that need.
So I might just ask Ian, what sort of difference would it make, you alluded to it in your talk, if we had a national cancer registry like that?
Well, I must stress it was a clinical cancer registry that I was after. We have a we have state cancer registries, which effectively are a national cancer registry, but that just tells us which cancers occur in this country and who's died of them. But what we really need is to understand more about how treatment impacts on the cancers, and where we can get the information for that is if we have a clinical cancer registry where that information is provided. We do need to work a bit on that. It won't happen automatically. We need the databases, but we also need a common data dictionary so we're all speaking the same language. Otherwise, it might as well be in Greek. It's very important if you're going to do this, that you don't rush into it. But on the other hand, I've been hearing about getting one going for the last 25 years and it's still not there. So we're certainly not rushing too fast. It gives us, particularly for rare cancers, it gives us a chance to actually look at what's happening with these cancers. We don't know, at least I don't know, I'm not sure my colleagues who are doing the clinical work know either, exactly how these cancers are being handled from place to place around the country at the moment, let alone on a basis where we can compare what we're doing with what's being done overseas, which would be really interesting. So we need, information is always the basis of the solution to problems. You have to start with the data. Once you've got that, then you can start to argue rationally about what should be done. I think that coming back to the issue of clinical trials and a clinical cancer registry actually is a necessity to bring out the value of clinical trials when cancers are rare. because that's where you can actually gather sufficient data over time, sometimes even without actually formally calling it a clinical trial, because you can...
Just the post-marketing surveillance.
Yeah, you can do post-marketing surveillance, you can do N-of-1 trials on individuals, and that looks fine until you try and work out whether it's actually really working across a spectrum of people and in which patients out of their subsets actually are getting the benefit. So it's all just part of a system which is set up to make sure that basically we're running the system efficiently. In other words, we're not wasting information that we've already got. I mean, I'm sure we can go and talk to government. Government are interested in containing costs. We have to demonstrate that what we're proposing to do is at the very least not going to cost them more money. And if we can show that in the long run it might save them money as well, then that'll give us an extra edge.
I'm sure many...
I wanted to be a little controversial about that point and an earlier point you raised around money. Obviously, it's in my interest to raise this, but I'll do it anyway. The challenge with much of the healthcare that we are looking at, this idea that somehow better technology and better treatments is going to save money down the line is just simply not true, and it never will.
I've never argued that it would. I've said it pays in other ways.
It does pay in other ways, and I guess
we wouldn't waste so much on treatments that don't work if we could target it.
This is exactly the point, is that we have a benchmark within the PBAC that's extraordinarily rigorous. We use thresholds that basically say there's a certain amount we pay per life year, and that's what we're going to pay. When you look, for example, at the debate around hepatitis C at the moment, there's a huge amount of controversy about whatever it's going to be, the $500 million a year that government will have to pay on treating hepatitis C. But there's absolutely no question whatsoever about the cost effectiveness of that therapy. The threshold on life years saved is about $15,000. I mean, the Australian government has never seen a better deal in its existence, ever. It would make sense to close down scores of current facilities and services in order to fund that. The challenge, though, is it's politically difficult and it takes guts. My sense is you could dramatically change the quality of care by shifting resources around based on the science that we have at our fingertips. The reason it doesn't happen is it's difficult, and that, for example, is why it's taken so long to have an MBS review that we should have had decades ago.
Totally.
Yes, I can't disagree with that. I mean, one of the crazy things that we do is that, the concept of the price for a year of life takes no consideration of what that life is actually worth before the treatment came along, before the disease came along. If you're looking at a 90-year-old, it's the same value for a year as if you're looking at a 30-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Graham?
I mean, I've sat through an awful lot of working groups and parties relating to the question of data. And uniform data that we all deserve to have about ourselves as individuals in this great democracy, and have repeatedly seen that fall foul of the structure of governance in this country. And if people knew how much that was costing them and their relatives every day of the week, they would have risen up decades ago and essentially said, we'd rather be like Sweden. That's all you have to say. Just say we'd rather be like Sweden and keep saying it until somebody gives it to you.
Now we need to wrap this session up, but I did want to go to the panel just to see if anyone had any last thoughts that they really wanted the audience to take from today's event. So Sally or Masum or?
Well, I'm looking for some fixes that we can support and advocate for and put the voice of the people affected by cancer. We need to fix how clinical trials are run and how much they cost and how long they take. We need to fix the health technology assessment process. And I think we also need to fix the ethics approval process, which seems to slow things down. We haven't mentioned. And I was going to mention post-marketing surveillance and whether that's a doable kind of thing and who does it, and is that something we should put on our list as well?
So some solutions rather than just...
outcomes and solutions.
Yeah, which I think today's been great because we have looked at the problem from some different angles that maybe people haven't thought of before. So anyone else like to sort of...
Can I just maybe build on what you've said, Sally, and what you've said, Carly's? We have an unprecedented opportunity to actually take action. We've just had the review of the TGA. Carly mentioned the Senate inquiry. There are some excellent recommendations that have come from that. The TGA review I think they had 34 recommendations, 14 of which were in the space of new chemical entities, and there are some very pragmatic recommendations there that talk about closer cooperations with overseas regulatory agencies, finding more pathways for expedited reviews, something similar to a breakthrough. If we go ahead and implement those, seriously, it's going to make a huge difference. And all the recommendations from the Senate inquiry, when was the last time we had a Senate inquiry? We seriously do have an unprecedented opportunity to act. And the final thing I'll say, I'm sorry to do this, is we mustn't delegate that responsibility to the government. They operate in a very, and you probably won't hear me say this very often, they operate under some very difficult circumstances. They have competing priorities, different things that they need to focus on, and there will always be budgetary constraints. It is not entirely the government's responsibility to come up with a solution. In fact, I would say it is it is a collective responsibility. Everyone in this room has a very important responsibility to work with government. And it is a shame that government's not here to have the discussion, but that's where I'll leave it.
We'll tell them, don't you worry. So, Christian, did you have a final comment?
To add.
Yeah, okay, John?
I mean, in addition to the Senate inquiry and the review of the TGA, there is a current review going on around the PBAC guidelines as well. So add to the opportunity to take to government. Government already does have all that data. I mean, the MBS data, PBS data from research, it's about linking that data and making it accessible. The ability to do that exists today. There's no question that we could access it and be able to analyse that data in a much more efficient and effective way for the benefit of us all. My final one is not a promotion or an advertisement, but I do have some publications down the back of a report that we've just completed and published, where we surveyed 1,456 patients, oncologists and carers around the things which are really important to cancer patients, and it's about that cancer patient journey and how we can improve on it. So if anyone wants a copy, they're down the back.
Excellent. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in this room. Ian, did you have any final thoughts?
I just think
David?
that in addition to the tools becoming available, like the Medicare and the PBS reviews and Senate inquiries, this is a time when you can actually do something tractably. The anecdotes are very frustrating because we're trying to translate them, but they're actually living. So to some extent, it's not just a question of opportunity, but we have content to take forward, which I think.
Graham?
Yeah, and communication among all parties, absolutely. Yeah.
Richard, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'll come back and wrap up.
All right. Well, everyone, please thank our panel. What a very insightful panel. And Richard, if you'd like to come and wrap up, Richard's just going to come and say a few closing remarks. And from my point of view, I just wanted to thank all the amazing speakers that we've had today. They're really such high quality, and it's been really interesting for me to hear what everyone's had to say. And thank you to Richard for asking me to be your host. And my little ad will be that I now have a health blog that Christian is one of my subscribers. So if you're interested in health and evidence-based, it's just put my name and blog and hopefully it'll pop up. But I'll be writing about issues like this and I would love to get your feedback. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd just like to run through a few thank yous of very deserving people. Firstly, the patients and carers who came today. I won't name you all because then I'll miss one, but there are people here who are living day to day with cancer, and none of this is theoretical for them, and there are people here who have lost loved ones to cancer, and none of this is theoretical. So it's always important. At Rare Cancers, we try not to go any longer than a week without talking to a patient. It keeps it real. Big thanks to Sophie. She's just been fantastic today. It's been a wonderful, wonderful thing. to all the speakers and panellists, yeah, just thank you. It's quite amazing to have industry, clinicians and patients all on the same panel talking about the same problem. We're delighted. And I'd also like to thank all the rare cancer staff. About 4:30 this morning, the phone went and the AV guy was locked outside the hall and we couldn't find anyone, and there were rare cancer staff across the country scrambling to find phone numbers and do everything. And but in particular, Plum, Charlene, Winnie, Eliza, and of course Kate, my wife and partner in crime, have just done an amazing job getting today together. The idea came from an organisation from a guy called David Leahy who were sitting in a pub, and he said we should have called it Pub to Podium. And that was nearly 12 months ago, and I did remind him today that having come up with the idea jointly, the next time I saw him was today. But that's all right. He did a fantastic job, and his PR agency does a lot of work for us, and we're very grateful. To the sponsors, specific sponsors of this event, MSD, BMS, AstraZeneca, and our partner, the Cancer Research Network with Graham Mann, has been fantastic. We have a whole bunch of other corporate supporters, which we're very grateful for, and they do an amazing job of supporting us, and we couldn't do any of this without them. And you, the rest of the audience, thank you. I'd like to leave you with two thoughts. 1 out of 2 people by the time of 85 will have cancer. The other one will be looking after that one, so we're all in this together. And I like the phrase, because it's mine, that it's our cancers, our choices, our money. It's not federal government money, it's our money, and we have to make them do what we want to do. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next year. Fantastic, mate.